We generally know that the summer solstice falls on June 21st or 22nd. The exact dates and times can be found at a site that I'll show you in a moment. I've collected this data and discovered something I didn't expect and which you may also find interesting. Here are the solstice dates in Toronto collected from this website, timeanddate.com, which also shows future dates to 2150. If we look here at the 50-year interval from 2050 to 2099, I've collected data for the June solstices and the December solstices, but I'm going to focus in this video on the June solstices. So June 20th will be the date of the summer solstice 43 times in these 50 years, and the 21st will occur 7 times. I've continued this way, collecting the data all the way down to 1 AD. Here's the data for the 100 years from 2000 to 2099. I've converted the number of times the solstice has appeared for each date into percents. In this century, 2000 to 2100, June 20th will be the summer solstice in Toronto 64% of the time, and June 21st 36% of the time. This data has been graphed. Here are the graphs for the June and December solstices from 2000 to 2100. The December or winter solstice will occur on December 21st 81% of the time, and the June solstice falls on the 20th 64% of the time. Now, as mentioned, I'm going to just focus on the June solstice. The December solstice follows a similar pattern. Now let's go backwards in 100-year intervals. We start here, 2000 to 2100. You've already seen this data. These pictures give an indication of some significant events that occurred in this century. I'll do this for each century to provide some historical context. In this century, 1900 to 2000, it was June 21st, 76% of the time, and June 22nd, 24% of the time. Next, 1800 to 1900, solstice was June 21st, 80% of the time. From 1700 to 1800, the June solstice ranged between June 9th to June 12th. This is a dramatic change of about 11 days that seem to have disappeared. How do we account for this loss of 11 days? It involves the change from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar. I need to pause here briefly to give you some background. You've likely heard of the Julian calendar started by Julius Caesar in 45 BC. It was in use until 1582 AD and longer in other countries. The Gregorian calendar, our current calendar, was started by Pope Gregory XIII in 1582. However, it was not universally adopted by all countries at the same time. The first to adopt were the Catholic countries of Europe: Spain, Portugal, France, Poland, Italy, the Catholic Low Countries, Luxembourg, and certain colonies. In Spain, for example, the change occurred on October 4th. The next day was October 15th, a loss of 11 days. Canada was neither a country nor a colony, so the October calendar was unaffected. Great Britain and its colonies adopted the Gregorian calendar in September 1752. Here we see September 2nd going to the 14th the next day, again accounting for the loss of 11 days. Just quickly for interest, here's a partial list of when countries adopted the current calendar. Here are the first ones already seen. Some other non-Catholic countries were suspicious of the Pope's intentions, thinking it might be a Catholic plot, so they delayed adoption of this calendar. Here, for example, is Great Britain and its colonies. Here is Greece and Turkey waiting until the 1920s, and most recently Saudi Arabia in 2016. Let's continue on. In this century, June 11th was the more frequent date of summer solstice. From 1500 to 1600, it was fairly evenly split between June 11th and 12th. From 1400 to 1500, it was June 12th. Then June 13th. Have you noticed how these most frequent solstice dates seem to be increasing one day at a time each century? Here it's June 14th. June 15th. June 16th. Fairly evenly split between the 16th and 17th. June 17th. June 18th. June 19th. June 20th. June 21st. Evenly split between the 21st and 22nd. June 22nd. June 23rd. And in the first century, a high of June 24th. Now I've taken the summer solstice that occurred most frequently in each century and graphed their dates in a linear fashion. Here's the data for both the June and December solstices. In the first 100 years, the solstice occurred most frequently, as we just saw, on the 24th. In the next century, it was on the 23rd, and so on. Here's the data graphed. On this graph, here's the 24th. In each following century, you can see a regular decrease of about 1 day at a time until 1753 for the June solstice and 1752 for the December solstice. We now know from earlier in the video that the 11 lost days started here in 1753 when the Julian calendar was replaced by the Gregorian calendar. But first, how to explain this steady decrease in the solstice dates? In the Julian calendar, a leap year is added every 4 years. This makes the calendar year agree fairly closely to the solar year. It was off by about 11 minutes per year. But the Julian calendar results in a loss of 1 day in about every 128 years. Now, since the physical setup of the solstice involving motions of Earth and Sun remain unchanged, extending the calendar by a day every 4 years makes the solstice appear a day earlier every 128 years. This explains the sloping line downwards. Over the centuries, it turned out that Easter became way out of sync with when it should have appeared according to Catholic custom. This was a serious problem for the Catholic Church. So, under Pope Gregory, one of his astronomers fixed this by reducing the number of times a leap year would occur. This brought the calendar year into greater agreement with the solar year. I'll pause here a moment to show what would happen if we retained the Julian calendar to see how far behind the Gregorian calendar we would be. Let's extend this line and consider the century 1900 to 2000. If we read off on the June axis, we see the solstice would be June 7th or 8th, closer to the 8th. We subtract the date June 8th from June 21st, which would leave us 13 days behind. Similarly, between 2000 and 2100, it would be 13 to 14 days behind. So the introduction of the Gregorian calendar has been very good in explaining a consistent date of June 21st or 20th for the summer solstice, and as we will see similarly, December 21st for the winter solstice. Now, just a final comment showing how the Gregorian calendar solved the changing dates in the Julian calendar. In the Julian calendar, a leap year was added every 4 years. Here's an example showing just the century years from 1000 to 2000. Every century year would have a leap year where 1 day was added at the end of February. To counteract the deficiency of this system, the Gregorian calendar was introduced, which eliminates those century years not evenly divisible by 400. This applies only to the century years. The years 1200, 1600, and 2000 would be leap years. All the others, which are not evenly divisible by 400, would not be leap years. This reduction in the number of leap years by the Gregorian system accounts for the consistent solstice dates since 1752. However, the Gregorian calendar is not perfect. It loses 26 seconds per year, another source says 27 seconds, which translates into 1 day every roughly 3,200 years. This will be of no concern to us until about the year 4900, at which time the Gregorian calendar will be 1 day ahead of the solar year. I wonder if humans will still be here. Finally, here is the December solstice dates following a very similar pattern to the June solstices. This ends my exploration into changes in the solstice dates.